Welcome to the last University Interdisciplinary Colloquium for the spring semester 2022. I'm going to start out with our land acknowledgement. So Michigan State University occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. In particular, the university resides on land ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. We recognize Michigan's 12 federally recognized Native nations, historic Indigenous communities in Michigan, Indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, and those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. In offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty, history, and experiences. We're going to drop some links to the full land acknowledgement and some more information about that in the chat. So for those of you who haven't attended the University Interdisciplinary Colloquium before, hi, I'm Stephanie Vasco. I'm the Managing Director for the Center for Interdisciplinarity and the Senior UX Researcher for Mesh Research here at MSU. The University Interdisciplinary Colloquium, or UIC as we call it, is a forum organized by C4I and sponsored by the College of Arts and Letters that highlights the innovative and important interdisciplinary work involving the arts and humanities at Michigan State. Interdisciplinary research at major universities is often code for well-funded, complex science. But some of the best and most influential interdisciplinary work reflects an appreciation for aesthetic and humanistic dimensions of the human experience, broadly construed. The UIC is an attempt to acknowledge and amplify interdisciplinary contributions that feature aesthetic and humanistic elements. We meet every other week during the fall and spring semesters, and we've been meeting via Zoom for the last few semesters. So today we have with us Professor Michael O'Rourke, who is the director for the Center for Interdisciplinarity, and he's with us to deliver a presentation entitled Skepticism about Interdisciplinarity. While he's delivering his presentation, if you have a question, please deposit it in the Zoom chat or use the webinar Q&A function. We encourage you to do this during the talk. Please feel free. After he's finished with his remarks, I will read the questions and comments out loud for response in the order they were asked. Professor Michael O'Rourke is a professor of philosophy and a faculty member in Ag Bio Research and Environmental Science and Policy at Michigan State University. He is the director of the MSU Center for Interdisciplinarity, the director of the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative, an NSF-sponsored research initiative that investigates philosophical approaches to facilitating interdisciplinary research, and executive director of the TDI Center, a new service center on campus that is the principal locus of Toolbox work. His research interests include interdisciplinary theory, epistemology, communication and epistemic integration and collaborative cross-disciplinary research, and linguistic communication between intelligent agents. He has been PI or co-PI on grants funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation, NASA, the Office of Naval Research, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. From 1998 to 2010, he served as the co-director of the Inland Northwest Philosophy Conference, and he was co-editor of the Topics in Contemporary Philosophy series published by the MIT Press. He is published in journals such as Synthèse, Bioscience, Philosophy of Science, Journal of Clinical and Translational Science, and Journal of Philosophy. With that, I would like to welcome Professor O'Rourke to give us a little bit of a talk about skepticism about interdisciplinarity today.
Thank you, Dr. Vasco. I appreciate it. And thanks everybody for making time today to be here. I really appreciate it. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully you're seeing the right thing.
No, we're seeing your presenter view.
Oh, you are? Okay. Well, let me try that again. How about now? Better?
Yep, now you're good.
Okay, sweet. I again appreciate that you decided to spend an hour here. It means a lot to me. Thank you. This is what the next hour of your life looks like if you choose to stay. I'm going to talk a little bit about my background as a philosopher, as an interdisciplinary philosopher. So a little bit about my bona fides as an interdisciplinarian. And then I'll talk a little bit about a couple of important preliminaries, given the focus of the talk. What is interdisciplinarity and what is it to be skeptical? So I want to sort of set the stage with a few remarks about what I will call the standard frame for understanding interdisciplinarity. And then I'll dive into the kind of the main body of the talk and discuss reasons to be skeptical about interdisciplinarity. I'll consider a few of them and provide some responses, and then I'll close with one that I find somewhat compelling. That might actually even be a way of thinking about interdisciplinarity that I believe. At least right now, that's kind of where I'm leaning. And I'll have a slide to conclude. The main goal that I have today is to just map some of the landscape of criticism that has been directed at interdisciplinarity and defend one skeptical perspective in particular. I'm not sure to what extent it's going to qualify as a defense, honestly. It's more like an articulation of the perspective. I hope that it does some, provides a little bit of motivation for embracing it or endorsing it. So a few words about me. Stephanie already mentioned what I spend my days doing at Michigan State. I've been at MSU since 2012, and I've been director of the Center for Interdisciplinarity since 2017. Stephanie mentioned this will be the last. This is the last UIC of the semester. It is also the last UIC of my tenure as director of the Center for Interdisciplinarity. I'll step down effective August 15th of this year. And so I think Stephanie thought it would be fitting for me to deliver a UIC at this time, which is why I'm on the program. At MSU, I've had an opportunity to be a part of a number of different interdisciplinary communities in addition to C4I, including Ag Bio Research, the Environmental Science and Policy Program, and the GenSen. So here, just a second. I way back when received training in graduate school as a philosopher of language, and I'm still a philosopher, even though I do lots of interdisciplinary things. I consider myself now an epistemologist and a philosopher of communication. So philosophers of language tend to focus in on specific aspects of the semantics of natural language, and I'm more interested these days in broader ways of thinking about how people communicate with one another. I've had a number of different opportunities to engage in interdisciplinary interdisciplinary projects over the course of my career. When I was at University of Idaho, I participated for about 8 years in an ONR funded, Office of Naval Research funded project that involved developing fleets of autonomous underwater vehicles to do mine countermeasures work. And my role in that project was to design agent communication languages and collaborative behavioral protocols that enabled the fleets to interact with one another and conduct open ocean long-term mine countermeasures work. I've also had the great good fortune of working with a number of philosophers and scientists to facilitate collaboration and communication in interdisciplinary teams through my participation in the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative. This got its start back in 2005. I was at University of Idaho at that time, and Toolbox Dialogue Initiative came with me to Michigan State in 2012. I think of myself as a philosopher who works on interdisciplinarity. So I spend quite a bit of time trying to think through and understand aspects of interdisciplinary collaboration and interdisciplinary research and practice. But I'm also an interdisciplinarian who engages with projects philosophically. So my work on the AUV project, for instance, was a contribution to what was broadly an engineering project, but my contributions were philosophical in nature, or at least philosophically inflected. As a philosopher, I'm kind of paid to engage in reflection. That's kind of my day job. And it's tough when you're a philosopher, if you're doing things, not to be reflective about them. It's sort of baked into you. And I think that, pretty much anything you're engaged in could also be the subject of reflection. So I've, I guess, engaged in career-long reflection on interdisciplinarity. I spent quite a bit of time early in graduate school in the Center for the Study of Language and Information. So I've been having the opportunity to communicate across disciplinary boundaries and learn from others about very different perspectives on topics that interest me since I got my start in academia. And that's led me to be a bit suspicious about what I'm going to call the standard frame for thinking about interdisciplinarity. I don't want to promise that just because I've been reflecting on this for my entire career that I've actually learned anything or gained any insight, but I am going to talk a little bit about what this reflection has yielded in my case. It's also, I guess, important to highlight that there's a lot of work to be done here. So interdisciplinary theory and the philosophy of interdisciplinarity is relatively unformed as a field. There are a few philosophers who are contributing to it, but for the most part, it's a kind of wide open area of potential research interest. Among the foundational questions that remain open are, kind of important questions like, what is it exactly? And what's involved in fostering it, right? If you can answer that first question to your satisfaction, and you think that interdisciplinarity, so understood, is worth pursuing, you might want to think a little bit about what it takes to foster it, what it takes to actually enable people to pursue meaningful and substantive interdisciplinarity. It's also kind of in hand in hand with that is the need to really reflect on where we should aim this type of research and practice. Interdisciplinarity is difficult, right? You're forced to be a student and a teacher as an expert. You're forced to learn different technical vernaculars and work with people who look at your common problems in different ways. And so I think it can be easier to just engage in disciplinary work and collaborate, if you wish, with people who speak the same technical language that you speak, who've read the same literatures that you've read. And that can be a little bit more comfortable, I think, whereas interdisciplinary work can be quite uncomfortable at times. So you might wonder, again, like, why should we do this? What is the point of going to all this trouble? And so thinking a little bit about the ends toward which we might foster interdisciplinarity is another question that I believe is worth, reflection. Anyway, that's kind of that's where the topic comes from for me. I think there's a lot of work to do here, and I feel like maybe there's some things we can do kind of at the front end that might help us deal with some of these important open questions. All right, I'd like to spend just a few minutes talking about some preliminaries that pertain to that kind of set the stage or the context for my remarks about skepticism. The first is I'm going to provide a gloss or characterization of interdisciplinarity. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I take disciplines to be, and then I'll speak to how you enter disciplines, so understood. And then I'll have a slide devoted to what it is to be skeptical. This is really intended for the philosophers in the audience, just to kind of, orient everybody toward what I mean by that term in the context of this talk. So the first preliminary is to basically provide some kind of characterization of the concept of interdisciplinarity as I'm using it in this talk. Much of the rhetoric of interdisciplinarity that's out there assumes what I'll call the standard frame, the standard way of thinking about interdisciplinarity. The first part of this frame is that the commitment to the existence of socially distributed things called disciplines that can be combined. That's the first piece. The second piece is that interdisciplinarity arises when disciplines are combined in some fashion, in some organizing frame. So there's a context within which like a project context, for example, or an administrative context that where the disciplines are combined in the production of interdisciplinarity. And the third piece is a more kind of teleological or purpose-focused piece, right? That this kind of combination is done with a view to responding to complex existential or global challenges. So that's the third part has to do with kind of why we should do this. It's related a little bit to that third open question that I mentioned before. So I'm going to go through each of these pieces of the standard frame in a little bit more detail. The first step or first piece of the standard frame involves the commitment to the existence of these socially distributed things called disciplines. And there's a lot of work out there in social, STS and sociology of knowledge, philosophy of interdisciplinarity on what disciplines are, what counts as a discipline. Some of this work highlights the epistemic dimensions of disciplines. So, the thinking of them as technology, really sort of social technology that can be marshaled for the production of new knowledge about various aspects of the world, various types of phenomena. Right? So the disciplines exist because they give us the best chance of actually gaining understanding about the world we live in. A second type of sort of project that people who think about disciplines engage in focuses on developing their social dimensions. So if you think of them as socially distributed things, you might want to focus on the fact that disciplines are at least coextensive with, if not identical with, communities of people who've been trained in similar ways, who ask similar research questions, use similar research methods, and pursue similar research objectives. And even in some cases, this work focuses on the economic dimensions of disciplines. So seeing disciplines as ways for communities of, epistemic communities to reproduce themselves, right? So by creating a discipline, what you are creating is a mechanism for ensuring that there will be future generations of people who worry about the same things that you worry about. I think it's also important to think of, useful for sure, but actually kind of centrally important to think of discipline here in this connection as a verb, right? So that pertains to the development of expertise. So if you wanted to run a marathon, you'd have to engage in a pretty rigorous regimen of discipline, physical discipline, in order to get yourself in a position to do that without dying. That takes time, and it takes commitment and effort and focus. And the same thing is true when we're talking about becoming an expert in a particular field or a particular domain, that you need to engage in a rigorous regimen of discipline, right? Committing to, learning, focusing on the acquisition of methods and facility with technical language and that sort of thing, that puts you in a position to actually pursue the construction or production of knowledge of a certain type in a way that's going to align with the norms and the expectations of the community that you hope to be a part of, right? So disciplining yourself is kind of what you do when you're in graduate school and beyond, on the way to becoming an expert. It's not uncommon to provide a kind of gloss that embraces several of these dimensions. That's actually my preference as well. So I like to think of disciplines as intrinsically constituted sets of practices sufficiently widespread and stable to receive institutional support. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail. If you have questions or thoughts about this way of thinking about disciplines, maybe you can ask me in the Q&A. One thing that I do want to kind of highlight here is this business of intrinsic constitution. There, the idea is that the practices that mark full-fledged participation in a discipline are in some sense kind of determined by and controlled by the community itself, and so that the community itself is sort of in charge of quality control of the work that's being produced in the discipline. So peer review is an example of this. What about the combination? So the second piece of the standard frame is that we take these disciplines and combine them in some fashion. So interdisciplinarity then is, as I mentioned in the description of the standard frame, it involves combining disciplines in an organizing frame. And I believe Julie Menes is in the audience. She's somebody I used to not emphasize organizing frame. Ever since getting to know Dr. Menes and learning from her work, I've instituted that, because it's important to recognize that this combination doesn't just take place in a vacuum, right? It's not willy-nilly. It's usually done for a purpose. And so I wanted to make sure that that's highlighted in how we should think about the combination that yields interdisciplinarity. And typically when people are, theorists of interdisciplinarity talk about it, they and talk about the combination that yields it, they locate interdisciplinarity sort of intermediate between what's called multidisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity. So MD and TD in this particular figure. And often the reason it's intermediate between these is explained often by appeal to this notion of integration. So the idea that the combination that's involved in producing interdisciplinarity involves integrating the disciplines in this organizing frame. And this notion of integration varies by degrees. So it can be, disciplines can be lightly integrated, maybe, for instance, just juxtaposing different disciplinary perspectives on a common problem. That might qualify as multidisciplinarity. Or it could be a really thoroughgoing, comprehensive type of integration in which the input disciplines are lost, right, in the production of something brand new. And in which case you have something more like transdisciplinarity. Interdisciplinarity involves typically, and again, kind of the standard way of thinking about it, involves combining disciplines in a way that maintains the integrity of the disciplines, but puts them into some kind of mutual dependence. So their roles in the production of some sort of interdisciplinary output are mutually dependent upon one another. There isn't a whole lot of work on integration out there. Integration is a topic that's discussed quite a bit across a range of disciplines, but there isn't a whole lot of theoretical work on just what exactly it is. We've done some of that work. Dr. Crowley, Dr. Larson, they're on the call, I think, are in the meeting at this point, and they've worked with me on thinking about what integration amounts to. We produced a paper a few years ago that provides a model for thinking about integration in terms of inputs, processes, and outputs, so an IPO type model, where integration is thought of as a process of inducing mutual dependencies among inputs in the production of an output. So this figure, which I'm not going to talk about, highlights some of the elements of that process and some of the parameters that we think need to be specified in order to understand it and use it for explanatory purposes in particular applications. The third piece of the standard frame involves motive response, right? So we engage in interdisciplinarity, the combination of disciplines in an organizing frame, for reasons, for not just to pass the time. I mean, typically we do this because we're interested in addressing something like the global grand challenges, complex, wicked problems like climate change or food security or sustainability. You might wonder why people think that interdisciplinarity is well positioned to help us with these, that it's maybe surprising, maybe not, but how often that that question, the why question here, is answered with this trope that we must meet complex problems with complex responses. Often, I mean, it's not uncommon in my experience to find papers almost one a week that start out, published papers that start out with this trope in some form. It makes sense. If you think of complex problems as problems that have parts that interact in some sophisticated way, systematic way, maybe it makes sense to break the complex problems down into their they'll analyze the problems down into their pieces. And if they're complex problems as widespread and kind of globally distributed as something like climate change, you shouldn't expect the pieces, once you've identified them, to all fall within the remit of a particular discipline. Instead, you should expect them to be, fall under the eye of many disciplines. And so you let the pieces get attention from the experts that have some familiarity with them, get some insights, and then combine those insights back into something like a coherent, complex response. And then the idea is that if you do that, then you put yourself in a position to better manage your response to the problem. Okay, for those of you who do this, all of this is old news. So apologies for spending so much time on it, but this is what the standard frame is. And this, when I'm talking about skepticism about interdisciplinarity, I'm talking about skepticism aimed at this way of thinking about it. So what do I mean by skeptical? I don't mean to invoke, the legends, philosophical legends of skepticism here. I'm not attempting to do anything like sophisticated epistemology. Basically, I'm just wanting to suggest, call to mind doubt, right? Being dubious. And it seems to me that there are three ways of having doubts about interdisciplinarity understood relative to the standard frame, right? There's, these terms I realize have other applications. So my apologies to you if I'm using a term you like in a way that doesn't align with how you prefer to use it. I'm happy to take suggestions for different monikers for these if you have them. I'll call the first existential doubt, which is being doubtful that there's any there, right? That when we use the notion of interdisciplinarity, we're actually using a substantive notion. Instead, maybe what we're doing is just talking nonsense without realizing it. A second form of doubt is political doubt, or what I'll call political doubt, which is basically intended to highlight the role that power plays in a performance and pursuit of interdisciplinarity. So in this case, having political doubt about it would amount to being doubtful about the powers that interdisciplinarity is supposed to possess, right? That perhaps interdisciplinarity really isn't all it's cracked up to be. And the final one is categorical doubt. So being doubtful about where the lines are drawn that delimit interdisciplinarity. I'm going to go through each of these in turn. I'll start with existential doubt. I'll give two versions of this, so an extreme version and a more modest version. I'll spend more time with the modest version. According to the extreme version, the problem here is this, that interdisciplinarity, the term, is a buzzword, which is to say that it's a popular kind of fashionable bit of jargon that's unmoored from whatever technical anchorages it might have had in the past, right? It just becomes this sort of free form lexical blank slate that can mean whatever a speaker might want it to mean, right? And so if this is what you think it is, right? If you just think it's a term that people use for whatever reasons they might have, not being systematic or historical, you might think that because it means so many different things, kind of in a sort of unsystematic way, that it really comes to mean nothing at all. So we should be very wary. If this is your view, then you should be very wary of the term when we encounter it, right? That you might be willing to engage in discourse with someone at your university who holds power over you, should they be talking about interdisciplinarity, but in your heart of hearts that you're really just talking nonsense. I'm kind of committed professionally to thinking that this particular form of existential doubt doesn't have much merit to it. Happy to, and to be honest, I haven't found that many published pieces that push this line. The most published pieces in which there's discussion of existential doubt takes a little bit more of a modest approach. The modest approach is related, right? It also has to do with how the term interdisciplinary and its cognates are used, right? And in particular, that they tend to be used in a way that undermines our ability to be precise, undermines our ability to kind of know that we're talking about the same thing. Interdisciplinary and is ambiguous. It's used as a cover term for all modes of disciplinary combination, and also for the name of a specific mode, one that's situated, as I mentioned, between multidisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity. It's vague. There's no principled way of determining what counts, especially along the borders. So especially when you're kind of thinking about whether or not something is or isn't interdisciplinary, sometimes it's really hard to tell. There's also not a very clear sense of what counts as more interdisciplinary or less interdisciplinary, right? So it's hard to know, in other words, because of its vagueness, it's hard to know whether what you have is or isn't interdisciplinary. And if it is, it's hard to know whether it's more or less interdisciplinary than something else that might qualify. It's also, it seems to me, not clear what the extension of the term is, right? The scale and scope of applications seem unlimited, right? So people, projects, programs, universities, even disciplines are interdisciplinary, right? So, and once again, once you've specified that something or identified something as interdisciplinary, it's hard to know kind of within, once you've gotten to that point, it's hard to be able to make finer distinctions among the interdisciplinary characteristics of that thing, owing to the vagueness of the term. Now, being ambiguous and vague, I mean, there are lots of terms that are ambiguous, both ambiguous and vague. So it's not like a deal breaker for making sense. But it does, it seems to me, in this case, because we're talking about a term interdisciplinary that's kind of a technical term, right? It strikes me that it's kind of a conceptual and semantic mess, right? Interdisciplinarity is polysemous in the wild, comprising differences in meaning that grade off in various directions. And if we're after a sense that grounds consensus, it isn't obvious how we're going to extract it from this situation. So we want to have some confidence that when we use this term, we're talking about the same thing. It's not clear from the just the ways in which this term is used that that we're really kind of on a path to that, right? To that kind of consensus. All right, so I think the modest concern, modest existential doubt is something to be taken very seriously. I mean, one thing you could do if if it's been a kind of a hard day and you're just like, not all that interested in spending too much time giving interdisciplinarity a chance, you might just assume, well, okay, it's a mess conceptually, semantically. It'll continue to have cachet as a buzzword, right? These things take on life of their own. But maybe nobody really knows what it means, right? It's a moving target, means different things at different times. Maybe we should just give up on it, right? Again, I'm kind of professionally committed to not giving up on it. So I think there are a couple of reasons that I'd like to lean on to motivate that. The first is that is to kind of emphasize that interdisciplinarity as a concept is relatively young. It's not very old. I think Julie Thompson Klein, in one of her books on highlights some of the earliest uses back in the 1920s, maybe, but it wasn't really until, I guess, around 1970 that things really took off for interdisciplinarity. And it's been used quite a lot lately, but it's still a relatively young concept. It's also a function of another squishy concept, this concept of discipline, which I kind of alluded to before. So it shouldn't be a surprise that something like this should take some time to clarify, right? I mean, this is the kind of thing that philosophers love to find, right? We're conceptual clarifiers, at least some of us think of our work that way. So finding something like this that seems to be important but also squishy, that's like a job for philosophers. So think of it as a work in progress. The alternative is to maybe not think of squishiness, of variability, of the messiness as a bug, but think of it as a feature, right? So if you're kind of like those of you who came to Abhishek's talk a couple of weeks ago, that's what he was focusing on, arguing that something was a feature, not a bug. So maybe that's what we should do here too, right? That interdisciplinarity represents one way to think of it is like there's disciplinary work and then there's ways to depart from disciplinary work. So let's just like use interdisciplinarity as a way of highlighting what it is to do research, but in a way that represents a departure from disciplinary research. If you take it to be that, then it should look and feel very different in different contexts, even though there are patterns perhaps in common across them. So this would be like, let's pursue a conception of interdisciplinarity that celebrates the messiness. I think a recent book by Julie Thompson Klein, published this year by Oxford, Beyond Interdisciplinarity, kind of explores this way of thinking about it, right? That it's a tapestry of patterns and rhetorics. I think this kind of builds out in interesting ways the Wittgensteinian idea that some concepts are family resemblance concepts, and maybe interdisciplinarity is something like that. I think both of these point to research agendas that are pretty interesting and give us reason to believe that the existential doubt that might be aimed at interdisciplinarity can be rebuffed. What about political doubt? There have been a couple of relatively recent pieces published by prominent intellectuals that push this line, right? So one is a Chronicle of Higher Education piece by Jonathan Kramnik, published in 2018, entitled "The Interdisciplinary Delusion." When this came out, I got bombed by people who I know who knew that I was directing a Center for Interdisciplinarity, asking me if I'd read it and what I thought. Kramnik says a few things like this at the top. Interdisciplinary fantasies are very much of the moment. And what seems distinctive about the current moment is the argument against the very existence of disciplines. A second piece published very recently by Conversation is entitled "Why the Interdisciplinary Push in Universities is Actually a Dangerous Anti-Disciplinary Trend." This is a piece published, written by Paul Griffiths. Who's a philosopher of science at University of Sydney. When I saw this, I saw the title, and before I read it, I became a little bit despondent, I guess. Paul is a colleague and somebody that we've worked with, somebody, in fact, he was one of the first members of the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative's advisory board. So I look at this, it's written by somebody I know and respect, and I'm thinking to myself, oh no. Paul, in this piece, Griffiths writes, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary are all nice buzzwords, and that talk of breaking down the barriers is often a cover for breaking down academic disciplines to create administrative flexibility. So breaking down barriers, I haven't mentioned that, but that's another way of thinking about combination, right? If you think of disciplines as silos, and then breaking down the barriers of the silos so that they can intermingle, that's what interdisciplinarity is about. It's a way of combining disciplines. Now, so both of these seem to be saying, look, interdisciplinarity isn't all that, right? That there's reason to push on the brake and maybe not dive in as deeply to interdisciplinarity as some might have us do. But the actual message of these pieces is complicated and kind of multifaceted. Kramnik's piece, which, by the way, I think is beautiful. I love that piece. I wish I'd written it myself. It's really a critique of reductive interdisciplinarity, right? So the idea that reductive interdisciplinarity is sort of this idea that we combine disciplines in part because what we want to do is we want to try to explain a single world, right? So all the disciplines could be combined, and contribute to an interdisciplinary combination that ultimately just gives us a single story about the world that we live in, right? So, and that's, in some ways, that's can be worked as an argument for eliminating disciplines. Once disciplines have contributed what they have to contribute to this interdisciplinary combination, we can get rid of them and focus on the interdisciplinary combination, right? But what Kramnik argues is instead for a conception of plural interdisciplinarity, kind of the idea that the disunity of science idea that in some ways the project of human explanation or scientific explanation of the world is a plural one, right? There are multiple worlds out there that don't necessarily worlds as targets of explanation that don't reduce to one another. We shouldn't expect psychology to reduce to neuroscience. We shouldn't expect biology to reduce to physics because they're asking different questions and they're carving things up in very different ways, right? So what Kramnik recommends is an interdisciplinarity that's interactive and regards each discipline as having something to contribute. And here what we get is a sort of view of interdisciplinarity as like, is involving something like an ecosystem of interdependent and systematically related disciplines. So instead of washing out the differences and reducing or eliminating disciplines to one discipline that rules them all, which would, of course, if that happened, be philosophy, but just set that aside. What we should aim to do is create an interdependent systematic set of relationships among disciplinary inputs that support a coherent response to a problem or a research question. Griffiths, in his article, really is aiming his ire at what we might call administrative interdisciplinarity. So using interdisciplinarity as a kind of bludgeon to solve particular administrative problems, like administrative sleight of hand to manage budgets and at the expense of high quality research and education. Griffiths, like Kramnik, are both fans of interdisciplinarity. They recognize good interdisciplinarity as a critical part of what we should be doing in institutions like universities. But both believe that you can't do that by undercutting the disciplines. I don't think Griffiths is as committed to the plural conception necessarily. It doesn't, at least he doesn't develop it in quite this way as Kramnik does. But they're both arguing that interdisciplinarity is important, but that it shouldn't be chosen over disciplinarity, right? So the political doubts sometimes aim at the way in which interdisciplinarity as a concept is wielded, often to make political choices in universities, which doesn't wind up, at least in many cases, being a critique of interdisciplinarity itself, but instead a critique of administrative decisions. So I think there's ways to resist existential and political doubt. Categorical doubt, I think, is another matter. And so I'm going to spend the last few minutes of my remarks talking about a version of categorical doubt. So one way to go here, if you buy the idea that there's a conceptual semantic messiness, is to embrace it, as I suggested. But another way is to stay committed to the idea that interdisciplinarity can be precise, can be meaningful, can be, a technical term that has, some. It's not a shape-shifting technical term, but it's something that we can kind of rely on. If we did that, one way maybe to pursue that might be to kind of remember that at least part of the semantic messiness that's attributable to interdisciplinarity is inherited from the semantic messiness of disciplinarity. So what if we were to reject disciplines as the unit of analysis, right? So this is what I'll consider. And here I'm kind of recommending that maybe we take a cue from Chomsky, who distinguished in some of his linguistics work between I languages and E languages. E languages are externalized languages, French, Russian, dialects with armies, as he calls them. I languages are internalized languages that are housed in the brains of individuals. And Chomsky argues that a science of language requires replacing dependence on E languages in our theoretical and empirical work with a reliance on I languages, focusing on the idiolects that are manifest in speakers of languages. What if we were to do that for interdisciplinarity? So distinguish between I disciplines and E disciplines. So E disciplines would be the externalized, socially distributed disciplines of the sort that we've been discussing, epistemic cultures or social cultures, the practices that discipline one into them, that one engages in order to become a member of one of these cultures, right? An expert that can contribute to the production of knowledge. Those would be the E disciplines. That's kind of what we've been talking about. That's what the standard frame, it seems to me, assumes. What if instead we talked about I disciplines? So I disciplines understood as kind of the internalized knowledge we have of a knowledge-making practice. These can be more or less well-developed, and we all have them. Everybody has an I discipline. And knowledge producers like scholars, these tend to be pretty sophisticated, but they won't typically be limited even in these sophisticated manifestations. Even in the most disciplinary of researchers, I kind of suspect that they won't be typically limited to one E discipline, right? You could think of these, I think, as mental models used to determine what's relevant and what isn't relevant in decision-making that drives inquiry. It may be that we possess several of them, several I-disciplines that are modular in their representations, but interacting in their influence. They would be complex for sure, probably inconsistent, or at least incomplete, and constantly under construction. And so probably various things are foregrounded in different contexts, and there may be no limit to what gets involved in an I-discipline. And we could still rely, if we went down this road, on integration as suggested by the standard frame, but going with I-disciplines would entail understanding integration kind of at this individual level, thinking about integration not at the level of the field, but instead at the level of the individual who is taking in new information all the time and constantly maintaining their mental models. I think this way of thinking about integration here is handled nicely by the input process output model. And it extends out in various ways. Integration of different I-disciplines is different by degree, not kind, no matter how far apart they are, in my view, I guess. And this is, I guess this way of thinking about this move would amount to rejecting the standard frame, and in a sense, seeing almost interdisciplinarity everywhere, right? So we're all interdisciplinary all the time, in the sense that we're, building complex, especially, I guess maybe I should take a step back. When we collaborate, when we work with other people, we're always being interdisciplinary, right? Maybe depending upon how you carve out the I-discipline in your own case, maybe you're just being disciplinary there, but you'd be interdisciplinary whenever you collaborated or communicated with anybody else on this way of thinking about it, which, it represents a kind of categorical doubt that might go in the opposite direction than you expected, right? So interdisciplinarity actually gets a much broader, wider distribution than you might have thought. Okay, I'll stop. Interdisciplinarity, all the rage, has been for some time. This despite the fact that nobody seems to know what the hell they're talking about. Apologies for the profanity. Semantically squishy concept that's rarely specified with any precision when it's used. This has engendered a variety of forms of skepticism about its meaning and its value. I believe that most of the forms of skepticism, at least that I've seen promulgated, can admit a response that favors interdisciplinarity. But I am leaning toward a conception of interdisciplinarity that I think could support a brighter conceptual future for the concept. Thanks to my many collaborators on campus and off. And thank you for coming. I appreciate it.
Michael, would you be able to make me a co-host, please, so that I can see the Q&A?
Sure.
Thank you.
What happened there? Okay, just a second. There you go.
All right, I'm going to take the first question that I see, which is from Bethany. And the question is, are you proposing that all interdisciplinarity is of I-disciplines only?
What if I am? Yeah, but I guess I'm, there's reason to, again, work the analogy with language. If you buy Chomsky's argument, that doesn't undermine the validity or importance of something like historical linguistics, right? Where we talk about language families and understand the ways in which language families have changed over time, right? That remains a viable area of study, even if you buy the I-language, E-language distinction. So that there's still interesting research questions that can be asked at this the e-language level, at that higher level. And I would expect the same to be true for interdisciplinarity. Chomsky's arguing for this distinction because he believes that we need to have a different unit of analysis if we're going to do empirical investigation into what language is and how it works. And I guess what I'm suggesting is that the same could be true for interdisciplinarity, that if we really want to try to get an empirical handle on interdisciplinarity, that this might be a way to go. But I'd want to kind of maintain, I guess, that like with language, there will still almost certainly be interesting higher level, sort of e-discipline level questions to ask about interdisciplinarity.
Our next question comes from Steve Crowley. On your account of interdisciplinarity, how do we account for the group level effects like disciplines, etc.?
So like disciplines, etc. I'm not sure what you mean by that, Steve. Could you maybe just expand on that in the chat a little? Just while you're doing that, I'll stammer for a second. It seems to me that part of the challenge in doing social analysis or analyzing anything that's social is making sense out of what emerges at the group level, right? So if you're thinking about something like joint action, right, making sense out of joint action, you need to appreciate how it is that we can, be individuals in our own sort of spatio-temporally isolated space, yet nevertheless do something with somebody else that we couldn't do by ourselves, right? So, Bratman talks about the give and go or lifting a piano, right? I mean, lots of examples of joint actions that we have to understand at this group level, even though we also have to understand how individuals contribute to the group level. I would imagine that some of the same challenges, theoretical challenges that arise for joint action and collective intentionality and sociality generally would be challenges that would emerge for theorists of interdisciplinarity interested in understanding group level effects, which is not really to answer your question, I don't think, but I do think that's I don't think we've encountered problems that are sui generis here. I think we'd encounter problems that have an echo with other domains of inquiry. Please correct me if I misunderstood the question, though.
And yeah, let's go with Bethany's follow-up. Do you think disciplinary integration can occur outside of an individual's mind?
Sure. You highlight that as a corollary to Steve's question. I think that's the right way to think about it. Again, work the analogy with joint action, right? I can't lift a piano by myself, no matter how hard I try. I can lift a piano with somebody else. So the lifting of the piano happens outside of me, right? I can't, that event takes place outside of me. And so I would expect there to be, interdisciplinary effects, outputs that are, attributable to the combination of different I-disciplines, right? So you get, it's still the case that we want to, even on this way of thinking about it, that we want to get together with other people who have different perspectives than we do and combine those perspectives. And the combination that you get, right, which you might write up in a grant proposal or an article, the combination that you get is not going to be something that you can just reduce to kind of an individual's I-discipline, I guess. So I think the answer has to be has to be yes. But I also think that it might be possible to explain that by appeal to I disciplines at the foundation.
All right, we only have 3 minutes left, but Professor O'Rourke will be sticking around for a few minutes afterward to answer some of the questions that are appearing in the chat and Q&A. We obviously won't have time to address all of them. So the next one I saw is from David Godden, and there's not a question mark on this question, so I'm just going to read the statement that's there. Question: if disciplines are to be treated as I-disciplines, such that each of us have our own, we dilute both the notions of discipline, disciplinarity, and interdisciplinarity. And I guess, David, I might ask you in the chat to put where the question is in that.
Yeah, I see that. That David's. I don't know if David's still with us, but I guess I'd resist that. I think the notions of discipline and interdisciplinarity, disciplinarity and interdisciplinarity as they are right now are a mess. Diluting them, actually, I'm not sure what that means, because I'm not sure what it is we're diluting. Part of the motivation for this is the idea that there isn't really much there to dilute, in my opinion. I guess it is a danger. If somebody were to publish tomorrow a piece that presented a way of thinking about disciplines that everybody rallied around and it just seemed right, then maybe something like this move would dilute that. That, to my mind, doesn't exist. So I don't think there's too much risk here. And even if it were the case, though, right? It may be that unless what's getting diluted can support more kind of empirical inquiry into the nature of interdisciplinarity, then diluting them might be exactly what we need to do in order to make real progress toward understanding what we're talking about. So I guess two-part answer. One, I don't think there's anything to be diluted at this point. And two, even if there were, I think it might still be a good reason. There might still be good motivation for doing it.
All right, with that, I just want to thank you, Professor O'Rourke, for helping us finish out our slate of UIC talks for spring of 2022, and invite anyone who's interested in continuing to further this discussion to stick around for a little bit here on Zoom.
Yeah, I'm happy to stay on for a while. I know there's some questions. I don't know if people have to leave, but I apologize for taking more time than I'd hoped, but that isn't kind of what you should expect with me, probably. I know there's stuff happening in the chat. I'm gonna start with the Q&A questions, if that's all right, and I'll just read through them and kind of see what I have to say about them, if that meets with y'all's approval. And by the way, we're done, so you can take off if you need to. I understand that you probably have other Zoom meetings at this point. But Fred asks, I would have thought that it's not just that you keep studying e-languages, looking at genealogies, but that what's going on in a person's I-language will interact with what's going on in the public e-languages. And so perhaps analogously with disciplines. So one wouldn't explain everything going on by just looking at the I-languages. And I think that's a really good point. I think, if we just think about how you learn languages, and you learn a new language, you sort of treat it as an e-language, and that guides acquisition of the new I-language. And so there's definitely interaction between levels between them. And so it's going to depend, I imagine, on the research question that you have. But if you understand, and really more the argument, I guess, if I were to sharpen it and a little bit, would be to see the I-languages as units of analysis, right? Or excuse me, I-disciplines as the units of analysis, right? So to replace these what I think is the current unit of analysis in the standard frame, the E-discipline, with I-disciplines as the unit of analysis. That doesn't preclude the appeal to e-languages in conducting research on interdisciplinarity. It doesn't preclude the possibility that I-languages and e-languages might interact in ways that are important to a full-blown understanding of interdisciplinarity. So Fred, I think your point's is a really nice one. So I appreciate that. Steve Crowley asks, how does I-disciplinarity differ from simply interacting with others? Are there interactions between folk, for two humans meeting for a beer, that are not interdisciplinary? I mean, I think differ from simply interacting with others. I guess I would say that interdisciplinarity is a kind of a theoretical frame, conceptual frame for understanding what's happening when people interact with one another, when they collaborate, when they communicate, what's happening, or I-disciplines, or if there's meaningful engagement, what's happening is that I-disciplines are undergoing transformation, and maybe in a transformation in the production of something collective. I think simple interaction will likely have interdisciplinary implications if you take I-disciplines to be the unit of analysis. The interdisciplinarity idea is a sort of an explanatory theoretical idea used to explain certain aspects of interaction. So I'd want to make sure that we not collapse one into the other. Although, please, if I'm missing the point, please let me know. I think it's an important one, right? That the implications of doing this is that there's something interdisciplinary about simple interactions. If you want to pay attention to that, you can, or not. But I think that's one of the implications. Maybe that's a bug, not a feature. I don't know. But I guess what I want to see is, like, if you and I, Stephen Crowley, are philosophers. We've spent many years together, and we've talked over many beers. Not very many lately, which is a real sad thing. But I think that's I think that what's happening there is maybe different in degree, but not different in kind from what's happening in more formal interdisciplinary contexts, where people from very different disciplines are trying to come together to produce something coherent. How many people are there still? 14. Okay, Stephen Rackman, thank you very much for this question. When comparing disciplines along the spectrum you propose, the MD-TD perspective or spectrum, which kinds of comparisons have afforded the greatest precision or clarity of what is at stake in the tensions between or among disciplines? Methodological ones, or is it more often the ones that take up different objects of study, or some other kind of difference? That's a really good question. And it's true that if you look out into the literature on especially integration, as it's discussed in connection with like interdisciplinarity, what you get is an appreciation for the fact that lots and lots of different things can be integrated. So there'd be ontological integration, or integration of the different kinds of objects of study, or epistemological or methodological integration. There's data integration. There's social integration of different people, and this kind of interpersonal interaction. For our purposes, I guess I could say that my own sort of theoretical tendencies here would be to try to lump rather than split. So I guess I'm a lumper more than a splitter when it comes to these things. So I'm inclined to want to try to treat them, to find something in common among all of them that accounts for why it is we think the notion of integration can work. It can help us understand what's going on there. So my inclination, I guess, is to see them all, treat them all as on all fours with one another, and then try to find something that, like a thread or threads that run through them, that would account for the fact that we feel like integration as a concept is a useful way of understanding them. So that's I'm not sure that I would prefer any one type of comparison over any other type of comparison, at least up front. That's kind of my take on it. Philip, and I'm going to keep talking as long as there are people there. I suppose when that number 14 drops down to 1, I'll probably stop talking. Although I can't promise that. Philip, could it be that we get too formal and academic about this subject? Is it possible that if we create a greater and less formal interactive culture between disciplines, that interdisciplinarity will happen more naturally? That's always a danger, in my opinion. That's like professional danger that I believe we constantly confront as academics, that we take things and make them and be too formal in our treatment of them and too academic in dealing with them. I think that's one of the reasons why maybe people who aren't academics, in some cases, may choose not to spend that much time with us. So I think it's always a danger. I think, but less flippantly, sorry. I actually think what this points to is a really interesting question. It's like, what would help encourage the kind of interdisciplinary combination that we might want to see in a particular context? If we had a sharp understanding of what interdisciplinarity was and how to measure it and how to evaluate it, would that help? I mean, because then we could say, here's the project, here's what we're going to do, here's how we're going to evaluate it. Maybe for some people that would help because they'd be confident that by contributing their time and energy to the project, they'll actually come up with something that will do the job that they've been asked to do. Maybe other people won't be as interested in those more formally constrained contexts, whereas the less formal, more interactive types of contexts might be really appealing to people to some other people, right? A second kind of angle on this might be to say, kind of think about the difference between top-down interdisciplinarity and bottom-up interdisciplinarity in the context of an institution. It's the literature, I think, points to the power of bottom-up participant-driven interdisciplinary combinations of being more successful long-term and more influential than top-down sort of administratively mandated interdisciplinary combinations. Not that the latter won't work; they often do work, but you might think of the latter as being more formal and the former as being more informal. And so that if I'm getting the distinction correct, Philip, that might be one particular sort of application of the suggestion that you're making that I think supports the suggestion, right? That there's reason to believe that this kind of formal top-down sort of effort may not be as successful as a more bottom-up one. I hate webinars. I'm sorry. I have no idea if what I'm saying makes any sense. Okay. So Yanfang, thank you. Do you think that the idea of interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity has a normative implication, that is, having a higher degree of integration is preferable? If that's the case, then maybe the power of interdisciplinarity lies in the fact that it's ambiguous and vague because we kind of assume we know what it means without knowing what exactly it means, like other buzzwords such as community. I think it's great. That's a great comment. Let me see. I definitely do think there are normative dimensions to interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity, for sure. I mean, I think it makes sense to ask, is some, in particular context, is one type of interdisciplinary combination better than another, relative to certain purposes or something like that. So maybe instrumental normativity, I guess. I'm not sure. I'll respond to this in the following way, and hopefully this will be something of a response. When we were getting the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative started as the Toolbox, we didn't really even think of it that way back then, 2005, and we were writing this paper. There were 10 of us who published a paper in Bioscience in 2007 that really launched the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative. And when we were working on it, my colleague Sanford Eigenbrod and I were encountering in the context with in interaction with some of the graduate students who were part of the project, who were IGERT graduate students, the Integrative Graduate Education and Research Traineeship graduate students, that some of them believe that the more integration, the better, right? So kind of what you're saying, the higher degree of integration is always preferable to a lower degree of integration. And Sanford and I talked about that for a long time. And I think we both concluded that we didn't think that was true, that we thought instead that the degree of integration was more of a function of the context and the needs of the people, that there might be, relative to resources like time and money, it might make more sense to pursue a multidisciplinary, less integrated response than a more integrated response. Because it might be the case in that context that if you pursued a more integrated response, you would just never get there. And so nothing would happen. And so I guess my take on it is that I don't think that a higher degree of integration is preferable always, maybe in some contexts relative to certain purposes. From my perspective, what that suggests is that I need to have a better understanding of integration and a better understanding of interdisciplinarity in order to be able to identify which contexts more integration is going to be better than less. So I need to have a better handle on variation here in order to be able to answer these questions. That's my take on it, I guess. Bethany, I-disciplines sound a lot like mental models. I agree. I think you even wrote that on a slide. I did. Should we stop studying interdisciplinarity and instead study mental models or sense making? I think that if this is pursued, if we want to talk about I-disciplines, then we need to talk about something. Mental models need to be a part of the conversation. Part of what I'm imagining, I guess, and thinking about I-disciplines is that they are complex in various ways. Mental models sometimes are a little bit more focused and precise. So as long as we can kind of expand out and understand mental models in this complex, kind of incomplete, possibly inconsistent, perhaps modular sort of way, that could very well be a good theoretical tool for cashing out in some detail what an I-discipline is. I don't, at least offhand at the moment, I don't have a problem with that. The proposal really, I guess, to the extent that it pushes the boundaries at all, is to take these mental models and treat them as the unit of analysis for interdisciplinarity, which I don't think is part and parcel of what people who work on mental models in psychology and elsewhere are want to commit to. At least I haven't encountered that way of thinking about it. The last one in the Q&A is from Edgar. There's still people here. Would you associate I-disciplines with interactional expertise? That would be that through these cross-disciplinary interactions, the internalization of disciplines blends, the internalization of disciplines blends, creating a new internal dialogue around how you look at a problem. I think so. I guess I would want to associate I-disciplines with interactional expertise. And actually, it highlights a question that I'm not sure I have an answer to. If I-disciplines are the unit of analysis, then I-discipline is going to be a key part of what if you have expertise, lived expertise in a particular field, local expertise, then that's going to be reflected in and probably grounded in the I-discipline, at least that's the way I'm thinking about it right now. And so, interactional, what your expertise is in is going to be like whether or not you're regarded as an expert in field X or in, topic Y is going to depend on how your expression of your I-discipline, I guess, your behavioral expression of your I-discipline is evaluated by people who are already regarded as experts in field X or topic Y. So the I discipline has to be kind of manifest in your behaviors in various ways in order for you to be attributed expertise in a particular domain. And I think that, I guess on this way of looking at it, any expertise you have, right? If you're a multiple expert, or if you have contributory expertise in this domain and interactional expertise in that domain, that's all going to be a part of the I discipline idea, right? The complex mental model. It's all going to be a part of that. And so I would want to try to, I haven't thought about how to line up the work and theory of expertise with this, but it would obviously be something that would need to be done in order for this to be fully cashed out. And this might also go back to Fred's point earlier about how I disciplines and E disciplines interact, right? So my acquisition of an interactional expertise in a particular domain is going to probably involve, at least in some cases, interaction with the E discipline, right? So I might require my interactional expertise at the foot of a master, right? So I'm just sort of tapping into their I discipline, maybe, but more often it's not this sort of top of the mountain kind of pursuit of interactional expertise, but instead, reading the literature and going to conferences and that sort of thing, interacting with multiple people. And so I think that might be an example of the kind of thing that Fred was talking about earlier. All right, that's all the Q&A questions. I'm sure 18 new messages in chat. I am going to save the chat. And if there are questions or challenges in here, unless, how many, 10 people. Unless you want me to do this a different way, which I'm willing to, what I propose to do is save the chat and then respond to you individually if you ask me a question. I noticed that there's some interaction between people in the chat, which is awesome. But if that sounds like an okay way to proceed, then maybe we'll call it a day and call it a colloquium. And again, I really, really, really appreciate you taking time to be here and offer your thoughts. And I'm obviously, that's all just very much a work in progress. So the chance to learn from you all has been wonderful. It's like I tell my students that the opportunities like this are so rare that you get to hang out with like a bunch of brilliant people who are going to focus on what you talk about for an hour. It's like, it's like, make sure that I, really express my gratitude to you for it. Okay. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate it. Take care now.